Welcome to Smash Avo Property. Today is the fourth of a new mini-series that I'm calling Tips from the Expert. My plan for this series is to talk to industry professionals who have a wide range of experience, seen the best and worst case scenarios, and help us make better informed decisions when it comes to property investing. It's all well and good to hear success stories from our generation, but because property is such a long-term game, it's also very important to hear from the experts. They've been around for a little while longer, watch multiple property cycles roll out, and give us some insights on what types of assets have performed consistently over time. Today, we are very fortunate to talk to one of my biggest mentors, Cate Bakos. Cate has an enormous background in the property space, including sales, mortgage broking, and now running her own buyer's agency, Cate Bakos Property. Cate is kind enough to walk us through her journey, including the transition out of a corporate job into pursuing her passion in property. And with her wealth of knowledge, she shares with us some of the key elements to look out for when investing.
Is land to asset ratio is absolutely key. So when agents say, oh yeah, but it's brand new, it's got all the deductions, I actually don't want brand new. I want something that has a land component that is highly valuable and worth more than 50% of the purchase price. In fact, I ideally want it to be worth more than 60, more than 70%.
As always, seek your own professional financial, legal, taxation and property investing advice for your current situation. Everything we talk about is just our opinion and general in nature and should never be considered as personal advice. So without any further ado, let's get house hunting with Cate. Cate Bakos, welcome to Smash Avo Property.
It's great to be on. Nice to finally meet you.
You too, Cate. I'm very excited for this one. You're a bit of an influencer of mine. I've been following you for a little while, and you're a good friend of Dave, who's a good friend of mine, and he's already given you a bit of a good rap on this podcast. So I think our listeners are pretty keen to delve into your insights. But to get us started, why don't you talk about a little bit about yourself? about your background, how you got into property and your business now at Cate Bakos Property.
Wow. I have the CV like a patchwork quilt. A little bit of everything from a long time ago. And I grew up down on the peninsula. I studied at uni and I was one of the first in my family to go to uni. So it was a big deal, but probably more of a big deal for my parents, if anything. And I was one of those kids that felt obliged to finishing a degree that wasn't the right one for me because I wasn't very good at speaking up back then. So I did a science degree and majored in chemistry, did chemistry honours and came out into industry, I guess, as a graduate chemist. But it was never, the right job for me. And I was acutely aware of that. And as I grew up and grew a little bit of confidence, I'd always had a love affair with property, which is where it starts for a lot of people. And I didn't have, a family who had come from property. So it was a little bit of an unusual one, but I spent a lot of time during my honours year going to auctions and tracking capital growth rates and looking at property performance as a whole across Melbourne and where I was living at the time. I was in East Brighton. And that was probably a big indicator. I remember my university professor telling me off for being more into property than my project. And he was right. He was absolutely right. So after a few years in corporate, I knew I had to, scratch the itch and get out there and try it. So I went into property sales in Sandringham and I had a great time. I learned a lot, particularly about how agencies operate, what the vendor experience is like, and really how, you deal with buyers and how you can buy a match. And that part of the role really appealed. So I knew a little bit about buyers advocates. I'd dealt with them before. I didn't necessarily rate some of the advocates that I got to meet. I saw a real cross-section, as you do. And, some would pick an inappropriate property and come along and see it and then not get back to me, and all of the classic things that advocates can do that annoy agents. And so it was good to experience it around the other way. And then when my daughter was on her way, as a pregnant mama to be, I decided I couldn't stay in property. So I did mortgage broking because I thought if I can stay close to residential property and do something analytical, I knew how banks operated. I dealt with refinances and equity releases and all of the things that you do as an investor anyway. So I had a pretty good grip on what was involved. So I did my study and worked as a broker for 4.5 years through the GFC, which was such an apprenticeship. It was really hard going. And I'll maintain that it was one of the best apprenticeships I could have done, but a difficult time for everybody. And I learned a lot about rapidly changing lending policy and things that can go wrong for buyers who aren't mindful of risk. So once I got my daughter to kinder, I was missing property transactions very much, and I knew that it was time to get back. So I studied for my Cert 4 and took a half a year off to do that. I did it at Swinburne, which was awesome, and set up a property business at Empower Wealth. So I was a director there for a little while, and then in 2014 I went out on my own. Amy came with me, so we had worked together prior to me going out my own, and we launched Cate Bakos Property. So that's where we are now.
Wow, what a story. That's incredible. I love that you've got so much history and journey there, like to be a mortgage broker during the GFC and like to even have that experience now, and I'm just like seeing it happen before. And I guess, a lot of people that would be listening to this podcast are probably younger and never experienced a depression or the GFC, financially at least. And I think that's why it's so critical to get people on like yourself to share that sort of journey and experience and tell us what it was like last time so that we can prepare for it this time. And I love that you've transitioned from what you studied and you weren't sure what you were studying. And I think a lot of people go through that journey, right? Like they go to uni, they study something because they feel like they have to, and then they don't really know and they transition eventually. And did you find, was that a long process? You said it was a couple of years, but was it hard mentally to get to that point to transfer out into your passion?
Yeah, it was. The hardest part was having a corporate salary. So by the time I transitioned, I'd already moved into a sales and marketing focused role. I'd got a real grip on, the idea of selling and relating to people and being a bit more outgoing with my personality. And the money's okay when you're in a corporate sales role. And that's the hard bit. You've set yourself up with debts. I had investment properties by then, so I was committed to maintaining repayments, and to think about leaving that for basically a commission driven role. And at the time that I went out into real estate sales, you got what's called a retainer, but you still have to pay it back. So your pay slip either has red or black on it. There's none of this free ride kind of caper. If you're sitting on your retainer each month and you're not delivering, your manager won't keep you forever. You've actually got that as a head start. It is really to kick things off for you and to help you find your feet in the role. But if you're not listing properties or making sales, and the secret in real estate sales is not just to be a salesperson, you've actually got to be a lister. That's where the opportunity is, and that's where the incentivized commissions are. So you've really got to be able to balance both. And being a good listing agent means you're meeting lots of vendors, you're confident, you're able to think laterally about how to sell a property that might need a bit of lateral thinking. Every single property is different, every buyer base is different. So yeah, it was a really good role for me, but the idea of jumping into that and giving up my corporate salary was the hardest bit. Utilising your skills that you have is easy. You can find ways to use your analytical skill base and differentiate yourself from the others, but managing your own time, you can bolt into the office at midday and muck around and leave at 5 and no one will tell you off, but you won't make any money. So you've got to be highly disciplined. You've got to make sure that you don't burn yourself out as well. You have to manage your energy levels and your stress levels when you're not getting days off, which at the start of anyone's journey, you don't get days off. I was pulling open for inspection boards out of the back of my white Astra every Saturday and every Sunday. I worked full weekends. So yeah, as a rookie agent, you really do have to do the hard yards. You have to sit there doing cold calls. There is nothing easy about it, but it was really good grounding.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that story. And I think a lot of, like, even myself, I'm kind of in that position, and I'm sure a lot of other listeners will be in that position as well, where they're passionate about property or whatever topic they're passionate in, but they might be having a couple of investment properties if they're listening to this, and kind of stuck in that position where they don't want to give up their pay salary, but then also want to pursue their passion. And so I love that you're a pure case study of that. And obviously you've come out on the good end.
You've got to think about it. It's an investment in yourself.
Yeah.
And I remember at the moment I thought, I'm doing this, I'm seriously, you feel like you're jumping off a cliff. I won a prize at the old corporation that I worked at. I was working at Dulux. It was an awesome environment, and I won a sales marketing prize. So there was prize money, and it was at that point I thought, I've got this money, and I could also get a bit of an extension of credit, of a line of credit off my existing mortgages, and pop it in there as Cate goes into real estate fund. And I had enough there to sustain myself for a year. So if I didn't have extravagant lifestyle habits and I could just maintain my mortgages, I knew I could give myself a year. I was either going to sink or swim.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think that's another case study of those safety buffers as well. Like, I know you and I bang on about it all the time, and it's just so essential to have, not even a rainy day fund there, but if you have that peace of mind to say, okay, I can step out, but I've got enough financials to keep me safe for 12 months, then even with the investment properties, then I can give it a red hot crack, which you obviously did. So I love that. And so you talked to us a little bit about being a buyer's agent in Cate Bakos Property. And, I think I've talked to a lot of them on this podcast, and there's been a whole influx of buyer's agents into the market at the moment. It's kind of like the hot new thing. Like, no one really wants to be a sales agent anymore because the name's tarnished or whatever it was. And my dad's a real estate agent, so I love real estate agents, so I've got nothing against them.
Me too.
But, they've it's like this big influx of these sort of younger investors wanting to become buyer's agents, sorting out their clients and all that sort of stuff. And obviously you've been around for a little while longer than all of that sort of stuff before it was the new hit thing. But how have you seen the industry change over that sort of period between you coming in and how it is now?
Yeah, breaking into buyer's agency has always been a challenging thing for anybody. There's no doubt about it. There's no university course you can do that just simply gets you into buyer's agency. And it's very hard to find a boss that says, come along and do an apprenticeship with me, like what I did with Amy. Amy was an apprentice for a while. You don't get many people doing that. And for a couple of reasons. If you've got enough work to keep you busy, but not enough for a second person, then clearly you won't put someone on. But also, if you do have enough work for someone else and they're not a business partner, you'll always be fearful that they'll learn the craft and then leave you and go out on their own. And that's a genuine fear for everybody. And it takes a special person to convince a boss that their loyalty is rock solid. And I think any boss you can't have someone for life. I mean, that's a silly expectation. Anything that they give you above and beyond normal expectations is a bonus. And, Amy is a case study. She's amazing. And could she go out on her own if she wanted? For sure. So the role that I have to play is to keep her challenged and to keep her learning something every day and to make sure it's enjoyable. Because the minute I'm not teaching her something or it's not enjoyable, that's when I'm at risk. So the other point that I'd make, though, is there's enough room for a lot of advocates out there. It's not like, you'd be destroyed if one person turned out to be a competitor. And we have seen an influx. And my concern isn't that there's too much competition or that I'm losing work. Not at all. As I said, there's enough work out there. My concern with the influx is not every single person who's coming out of there's a system at the moment where someone's purporting to, have graduates earning 7-figure salaries or 6-figure salaries. And it doesn't work like that at the start. You've actually got to work it very hard and consistently and, build a special offering and a rock solid business to be able to do that. So you'll always see a lot of people chasing the dollar when there's a promise of, working less and earning more. And it's a funny one because when you first go into a role like real estate, you're working more and earning less. That is absolutely how it goes. And I remember, my transition from corporate to property sales, I was working ridiculous hours each week and not earning the money I'd been earning at Dulux. But, the idea was that I would gain confidence and experience and eventually earn considerably more. That's what it's all about. But we've got a lot of new entrants out there right now that don't have the same training background as what Victorian licensed agents who have done their training in Victoria have. So our state-based legislation is what determines the qualifications that a BA needs. And unfortunately, it's not consistent. I think that's probably the root cause with this at the moment, that we have states that do things differently. But there is a methodology out there where you can transition your license from one state to another with what's called mutual recognition. And if you've trained in one state where your training regime was 5 days, and then you're coming into another state where the training regime should be 6 months plus a year in the industry working under someone, then you've got chalk and cheese. You've got one buyer's agent who's done a Wheaties packet ticket, and then you've got someone else who's worked under a fully licensed real estate agent or buyer's agent. We're all real estate agents in Victoria. And then they've done, the full 26 modules and probably done it at uni. So they're two very different qualifications, and therein lies your issue. And I think the risk to our industry, as I said, is not losing work. It's someone who doesn't know what they don't know, making a massive mistake and shining a bad spotlight on what an experienced advocate who's had the appropriate training and the appropriate mentoring for that full year would know not to do. That's the biggest fear.
Yeah, that's crazy. I've heard the story of some states having only a 5-day training period to get to, I don't know if it's your full license or a subset of license.
Unfortunately, when the license is obtained and then the mutual recognition is obtained in Victoria, the Victorian license is the full license. So we've got full license holding Victorian BAs who have not done the Victorian regimes. So they've got the short course version. And I do mean it, what you don't know is what you don't know. And it could really bite, whether it's biting the consumer or biting that business or biting the industry as a whole. It's a real worry. And
yeah, for sure.
As I said, there are a few out there, but it's not for everyone. So it's easy to jump into something and do a course and hope to earn, 6 figures pretty quickly. But signing up business is one thing, fulfilling business really well is another, and sustaining the energy and the passion for it is another one again. And it's not for everyone. So you'll see people come in that won't last, and then you get your really passionate ones that do manage to learn and manage to get mentoring and have some great connections and make enough benign mistakes to learn some valuable lessons. And I've got no doubt that, the influx, I'm sure I know there are some winners in that group. So it's not black and white. It's a difficult one, but I think it's up to our study and legislators to work out how we actually recognise this qualification so that consumers know the difference.
Yeah, for sure. And for the people that are just learning about this now and sort of maybe a little bit confused, maybe they've talked to a buyer's agent and then they're a bit scared if they're right, or if they're wrong, or, what experience they do have. Is there some questions that they should potentially ask a buyer's agent before working with them?
They should ask for experience.
Fair enough. Experience and all right. Yeah, fair enough. I agree.
There's a lot of questions that BAs get asked, and there's checklists that float around. Reba has a checklist as one example, and I get a lot of prospective clients asking me the classic questions of all of your insurances in place, you're fully licensed. Have you got any people that I could talk to, or any testimonials I could read, genuine testimonials, or any case studies you could discuss with me that are similar to my brief? Who will be looking after my file? Will I be speaking to you, Cate, or will I be talking to someone who works for you? They're really good questions, because not only are you working out, the person's qualifications and their insurance levels, but you're also understanding how the journey will go and what it will feel like. And there's a host of questions that should be asked, but I think a really critical one is when you ask for experience. What's your experience as a buyer's agent? How many clients have you worked with over the years for a fee? Where do you work? Do you receive any payments from anyone else other than the buyer? That's a critical one, because an independent buyer's agent can't take payments. They can't take kickbacks or rebates or anything like that. And they can't be selling off a stock list. They can't be performing any sales function when it comes to the sale of property. They're a buyer.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. I love that you touched on if they're getting paid from anyone else. And I guess that brings in the whole spruiker conversation, which I've had many times before on this podcast, but it's definitely something to be aware of. And I think, touching on the experience validated as well, go online, in this age of online reviews and Google and all that sort of stuff, it's hard to hide
Yes.
behind a bad review. So
Yeah.
as much as they're telling you something, also go and validate that in any way that you possibly can, word of mouth,
Yeah.
online or anything, or talk to professionals in the industry as well and see if they've had a run-in
Yeah.
with them.
Yes.
So, although we can't cover everything in one question or talk about everything specifically you should look out for in a property, as a
Yeah.
very experienced buyer's agents, what are some of the sort of key high level things that you would look out for in an investment property?
Yeah, it's a great question. I looked at this question and thought, how can I answer this quickly? Probably two principles. So the first one is the John West principle. What makes John West the best is the fish that are rejected. You got to reject a lot of fish. So
That's
when we're
true.
doing our searches online, main roads, train lines, too brand new, like all of the things that will determine us saying, no, it might be the wrong orientation, terrible layout, what it's next to, what it's opposite, noise levels. There are so many things. So you've got to look at a property through the lens of an owner-occupier and ask yourself, if I was an owner-occ and I was wanting to live in, let's say, Yarraville, my backyard, what are the things that would get me really excited about this genre of dwelling? So if I'm looking for apartments in Yarraville, what are the things that would get me excited as an owner? Because you're looking for owner-occupier appeal. It's got a very emotive force to it. When agents say, oh, it's a great investment, it might be a great investment because it has massive tax deductions. That there are all kinds of reasons why people say it's a good investment. A good investment is what that particular genre of property in that area would excite. How much excitement would it produce for an owner-occupier? And the second thing that I'd say is land to asset ratio is absolutely key. So when agents say, oh yeah, but it's brand new, it's got all the deductions, I actually don't want brand new. I want something that has a land component that is highly valuable and worth more than 50% of the purchase price. In fact, I'd ideally want it to be worth more than 60, more than 70%, depending on the cash flows that the investor can sustain, the amount of maintenance that they can handle, the vacancy rates in the area, and our ability to get a good tenant. You've got to look at all of those things. And clearly, if you go for a land to asset ratio of 99, you'll have fantastic capital growth, but you might have a really terrible experience getting a good tenant or keeping a good tenant. And you might get miserable rent and have maintenance call outs all the time. So, the optimal is sort of, depending on the client, is pretty much 65 to 90% land to asset ratio. And it's not a perfect science. It's a real estimated science. But what it means is that you're not paying a premium for the dwelling component, because dwellings depreciate and land appreciates.
Yeah, I think they're probably my two. Well, yeah, they're definitely my top 5 things to look out for. I'd agree with you completely. And, I think over all the years and all the things that I listen to, and, I've got this list of 100 things that I look for in an investment property. And, we're in the position to get another one again. And I'm just going through the listings and I'm like, I'm trying to find this perfect property that ticks all of the boxes. And sometimes you can't, but it's really taking it back to those original, key foundations, own occupy appeal and to asset ratio. There's really key elements in going, okay, this ticks those boxes at the very minimum. And then if you want to get into things like, noise levels and everything else that you talked about before, it's how many other boxes can you tick along the way?
Yeah.
But just getting those fundamentals right is so essential. And, a lot of people listening to this podcast will be first-time buyers, or maybe they've got one property and they're looking to get into their next. And, unfortunately, because property is a long-term game, it's sometimes really hard to calculate or understand what you have purchased until 10 or 20 years, until you've seen, how it performed over that time. And, some people could have seen a lot of capital growth in the first 3 years and been able to pull out equity and go again. But then the next 7 years after that might be slow because the market's just catching up. You know what I mean? So it's hard to presume certain things or the performance that it's had in recent years is going to continue for the life of the asset. But
Yes.
and in terms in that, what ties in with that is mistakes as well. And do you think there's some sort of common misconceptions that sort of first time buyers make along the journey?
Yeah, there's quite a few, and it depends on the first home buyer or the first time buyer. Those who don't want to save for a deposit and want to do it the easy way will pay a premium. And the premium is that they'll probably be forced to buy something brand new because of the way that, off the plan and brand new savings work. They might buy something that they don't have to put much deposit down for, so they've secured their place on the property ladder. When things go well, it's okay. When things go badly, it's an absolute nightmare. So I would encourage anyone who thinks the easy way out is to buy off the plan to really do their homework first and understand that they're taking a chance in a volatile market where, if the sunset date arrives and the property is ready to be settled, if the price that they paid is not agreed to by the valuer a few years down the track, they'll find themselves either scrambling for the difference or unable to complete the purchase. And that's just one of the headaches. So they've got to think carefully about it. Another mistake I see first-time buyers commonly making is not being clear about whether it's a home or an investment. Because as soon as you want both, it gets really tricky. You can buy a home where you want to be with what you've got that matches the dwelling type you're eligible for. And then you've got to think about investment principles. So you'll reject certain dwellings on the back of, things that you can fault them for. But expecting something to give you outperformance and be the perfect home can often have you sort of stuck in limbo land, and wasted time in a moving market can cost you. So I often say to people, if it's a home, buy a great home. Be finicky, but stop looking at it as a pure investment. Another mistake I see people make is listening to the wrong people or being too hung up on what mum and dad say. And I know that's a really hard thing, especially if they're helping financially. It can be very difficult. But I know firsthand from experience that I took my dad's advice at the start, and the things I let go because of my dad's fear of debt and concern for me came from a genuine place. He was loving me and looking out for me, but he gave me bad advice. And if I'd bought the property or the properties that I wanted to buy at the beginning and hadn't consulted with my dad, I would have done really well. So they've got to build a strategy and stick to it and find people who they can trust or choose to listen to, whether it's great podcasters or whether it's a fantastic advisor, whether it's a buyer's agent that they're paying. And they've got to work with that person and keep the communication really honest, but not reach out to people who aren't, necessarily going to be the best advisors for them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a couple of things that you touched on there also tie in together. So, over the last 30 years, we've had really strong economic growth in Australia. We've done really well. I know you said the GFC was pretty hard, but, we got out of it pretty easily compared to some other countries.
Yeah, Australian property bounced. It was one of the most exciting fees to ever work through. It was incredible. We had Kevin Rudd throwing money at stimulus packages and incentivising first home buyers, and interest rates. At the time, I thought 5% was really cheap. I was beside myself. It was a great bounce back.
Yeah. So growing up, I was always taught that property doubles in values every 7 years, 7 to 10 years. Every property is the same. You know what I mean? And I think that's why a lot of our younger generation get caught up in these off the plan apartments, because they're buying a property. They don't differentiate the different types of classes of assets. And so, all they've been told their whole life is to get into a property and pay the debt down and just get into property. And now I think we're at this point where, obviously no one's got a crystal ball and no one can predict the future. And, we might not see that strong economic growth for the next 30 years. So we've got to be really careful with the assets that we do select and we do perform. And I think, that off the plan apartment story, as you said, can be really bad for some. And we've seen plenty of case studies of that happen. And, that's why it's so important to have that asset selection process. And I think everything that you've talked about sort of flows in and out of each other as well. So there's some really great ones. And just speaking of, talking to professionals and people in the industry, I know that on your podcast, the property planner, buyer and professor, you work with two other really industry heavy bodyweights. I know Dave's a good friend of mine and been on here before, and Pete I've had a couple of discussions with, and they're definitely mentors of mine as well as yourself, Kate. But why do you think it is so important to get information from the right people?
Well, you've got to rely on fact, and there's a lot of fact out there, but everybody who is in this industry has an aspect of it that they specialize in. So you've got to pick someone who has a similar philosophy around property investing as you, because there's lots of different ways to invest, and none of them are right or wrong. They're all individual. Whatever works for you is right. And so that might mean that your debt retirement strategy has you diversifying into other asset classes and selling down some property along the way. It could mean that you're always a passive investor who has an income through rental returns, and you might be a rent investor by practice. There's just so many different ways to do it. You see builders and developers and people who are improving homes and flippers, they're doing the active property investment journey. And those who do it well, they're fantastic people to watch and follow, but pick the one that will work for you. Because if you're so flat chat, you can barely make a dentist meeting work, then you shouldn't be buying a property that needs a renovation or a subdivision, because you're struggling to go to the dentist. You'll be struggling to get on site and manage a project. So it all comes down to working out what works for you and what your end game is. What are your end goals? How will you get there? Will you need to collect some properties that are lower capital growth type properties, giving you stronger returns that you can pay down completely and go into retirement holding a complete portfolio? Or will you have some partial sell downs or total sell downs? There's a lot of questions there that you've got to ask, but having good people along the way to lean on is not just to get great information, but it's also to give you guidance at the critical decision-making points. So if you've got a situation where you could either sell something or keep something or develop it or whatever it might be, if you can lean on someone who understands what your end game is and what skills you bring to the table and what your financial position is in terms of making these decisions, they can give you some specific advice if you're paying them for that and they're qualified. But if you've got a good network of people and they're just like mentors, then you can lean on them for information or just for sometimes picking you up and putting you back on the horse and giving you a pat on the back when you've had a hard time. So there's lots of value in having industry friends.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you've touched on two really great points there, is that identifying your risk profile and identifying your end goals. And I think they're, the first thing that anyone should ask themselves when they get into investing. And I guess that helps along the process in managing their risks and their risk profile moving forward. And can they afford to, if something was to go wrong and they were doing a development, can they afford to take that out? Can they get another loan from the bank, or is it just too risky and they just want to sit on an investment property? And although there are little strategies to manage your risk, what are some of the key ones that probably younger investors could probably take away and use moving forward?
Be really mindful of your LVR, your global LVR. So it's all well and good at the very beginning to bite off a little bit more risk than an older investor might do, but thinking forward, when you're taking hefty risks and financing things to 90 or 95, you can't consider that a commonplace way of doing business. You've actually got to get yourself into a position where you can start having non-LMI deals and structuring yourself properly with existing equity and not be in a position where you're paying mortgage insurance on every deal and flying close to the wind with everything. Because if there's a market contraction and you find that you're underwater, things get really ugly when your ability to pay your debt is in question. So let's say you're underwater and you lost your job or you stepped down or whatever it was, or you borrowed as much as you could based on two incomes and suddenly you've got children and one person has stepped down. It's when you can't pay your bills that the bank will make life really tough for you. And I'm not talking about coronavirus period. I'm just talking about hefty risk takers who find themselves underwater and in arrears. It's a really ugly situation to get yourself into. And I think every multi-property investor owes it to themselves to have a bit of a war chest or a nest egg of money for all kinds of things that can come up. And I've said it before, I remember one January where we had 5 hot water services all go in the same month. And our little line of credit or a war chest didn't cover all of that. And It was a real eye-opener. You've got to increase your war chest as you increase your number of properties in your portfolio. Otherwise, you can turn 1 month into one of the ugliest months you've ever had.
Well, I think it is times like these where people sort of do realize that, and as you said, you're in a bit of an awkward position where everything came in 1 month, and I think people that are in times like this and maybe didn't have that war chest ready to go or enough cash buffer, or sort of in an awkward position now, use that to prepare yourself moving forward, and understand that it is risky. And if you can't, we're lucky that we've got things like repayment holidays and things now to get us through, and government grants and stimulus and job seeker and keeper to keep us employed and have money coming in. But in a situation that's not a global pandemic and we don't have that sort of stimulus, it can happen to anyone, as you just said. So I think that's super important. And apart from your two amazing podcasts, are there other resources that you would recommend for other people to do more research?
Yeah, there's a lot online that is fantastic. And then you've got regular bloggers as well. I'm a Generation X, so I actually still enjoy reading things. I don't have to, see 1 minute videos to learn something. I always make sure I spend time on the weekend reading the AFR and all of the property articles. They're fantastic, and you've got some really clever journos that go to good sources for a lot of their information. So that's one. You've got people in the industry. Peter Wargent is one of my favourites, and he puts out a daily blog. And if you could just put aside a few minutes each day to read Pete's daily blog, you'll learn so much. I know I've given him a big plug, and he's a mate of mine as well. But it's an awesome resource. And there are a lot of people that put out blogs. And so it's worth having a look at all of those. If you are looking online on the socials and whizzing through LinkedIn, and you can see someone who's putting out good content on a regular basis, it's worth checking their site and seeing what blogs they do. Because there's a wealth of information out there. And then you've got your books that you can pull off the shelf and read. I don't even know where to start. I soaked so many of them up when I was young, and I got a really really good understanding of the different ways of building wealth through real estate by reading all of the older classic wealth coaches and advisors, like your Jan Summers, and there were some really good early ones out there. I read Steve McKnight years ago, and he's the guy that bought up half of Ballarat at the lower socioeconomic end of the market and had impressive rental yields, which aren't at that level now. I think Steve got in at a time when the rental yields were enormous. But there's so many different ways to look at property investing, and understanding how people do it differently helps you work out where you think your wealth creation best sits for you.
Yeah, and I think the common theme that you've sort of demonstrated throughout this video or podcast is that there's diversification. There's so many different ways that you can invest, and you can develop. You can buy investment properties. So many different strategies that you can go down. And I think having a big bookshelf, or a big list of podcasts that you listen to, and just understand what everyone's got to say, and then pick out the pieces that you identify with and think that works for you is super critical. And then even if those other strategies don't work for you, you're still knowledgeable about them and understand how they work and how they might interact with the type of investing that you're doing. So I think that's a really good overview perspective. I think a lot of other professionals sort of fire down one barrel and say, you got to go for capital growth properties, or you got to do this, or you got to do that, where you're sort of given that whole retrospect, which I love. And on that sort of final note, is there anything that you would give as a sort of piece of final advice to any younger investors out there?
Yeah, knowing that there are so many different ways to do this, do your research and work out which way is going to work for you. And the best ingredient in all of this is patience. Don't ever for a second think that you'll have to see a result overnight, and don't chop and change with your strategy. I see too many people buy a good property that worked for their strategy. It fitted in fine, and then they've got impatient. They've done an about face. They want more money more quickly. They've sold it. They've bought something else. They're jumping around, and all they're doing is feeding agent commission and boosting up our stamp duty income into our state government revenue. And it doesn't make any sense. They've got to be really, really patient. And the other thing that I'll say is properties are like people. They're all individual and none of them are perfect. You can get some that are really good and score very highly, but you'll never, ever get a 100% scorer. So if you're holding out looking for that elusive, perfect property and you're wasting your opportunity in the market, your lost opportunity is going by the day. And I think you've got to be prepared to back yourself and accept that you won't get a 100% result. But when you stick to your strategy and you're patient, you will get a good result.
Love it. I think that's perfect advice, and I wish we could sit and talk to you all day, but we won't hold you on too long, Kate. But thanks again for coming on. You've been absolutely amazing.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
What an incredible conversation. I really appreciate Kate coming on and sharing her story and insights with us. I learned a ton out of this conversation, and it's good to get validation on what to look out for when choosing our council of advisors. I'm always looking for more guests to come onto the show. If you're under 30 and have one or more investment properties, whether it's good, bad or ugly, I would love to talk to you about it. Even if you're interested into getting into the property sector, let's have a chat. The main focus is to help other soon-to-be young investors with tips and tricks along the journey, learn from the mistakes that we have made, and ignite the fire to set themselves up financially for the rest of their lives. If you're interested in sharing a story, you can go to jordandeong.com/podcast, where there's a podcast inquiry button at the top that will guide you through the next steps. If you want to see what else I'm up to, you can go to YouTube and type in Jordan de Jong, where you'll find the Smashed Ever Property podcast being hosted on YouTube, and plenty of other content that I'm putting out consistently. If you're keen for more content like this, make sure you subscribe, and please leave us a review with any feedback for future podcasts. And until next time, happy house hunting.